All right. Again, welcome everyone to today's episode of Bright Spots in ABCD. My name is Eric Smith. I'll be your moderator for today's session, which is hosted by Great Lakes Urban. I have the distinct pleasure and honor of serving as executive director. Great Lakes Urban connects people in community and strengthens their efforts to build stronger, safer, more connected, more vibrant neighborhoods, communities, and cities. Our quarterly Bright Spots and ABCD episodes are a way to spread best practices in neighborhood flourishing by interviewing practitioners and thought leaders in the asset-based community or ABCD movement. A question we have that's come up often from you, our community, is this. Churches and congregations have played a vital role in cultivating the social fabric of neighborhoods. However, how does that look today in our communities? How are faith communities being a part of the abundance and the joy that's found in flourishing neighborhoods? To help us explore this topic, we have the very good fortune to have with us today Tim Soerens. And Tim is the co-founder and the executive director of Parish Collective. We also have with us Pastor Brian Fulton, founding pastor of Missio Dei Lincoln Square. And I'm excited to be with you all to learn from this discussion today. A couple of housekeeping. You've already heard me say asset-based community development, or ABCD, as we often shorten it. And so a quick definition on that might be this. ABCD is a community-driven, relationally oriented, place-centered, asset-based, and inclusion-focused approach to community strengthening. It's about people living in local places and taking responsibility for each other and for their local resources. And then one more quick thing here. I already see there's a message in the chat, and so we'll use chat throughout this as well. But also, if you have questions, I want to start us off with some questions just to pull out some of the big story that Tim and Brian have for us, Pastor Brian. But if you have questions, we'll turn to those in the last 20 minutes or so of our session today. So at the bottom of your screen, you'll see where there's a little box that says Q&A. And that's a great place to put your questions. If you need to throw it up in the chat, that's fine. But use that Q&A if you can. So with that, I'd like to let's start off with just sort of giving you some space, Tim and Pastor Brian, to say a little bit more about yourself and what brings you into this kind of place-based work. Tim, do you want to start us off?
Sure. Well, it's a real joy and gift to be with all of you in this space. I think I might have some friends. I know I do in Jay, who might be lurking somewhere off of our screen. Yeah, which is lovely. As Eric said, my name's Tim. I live in Chicago, but I lived for 20 years in Seattle and just moved to Chicago about 6 months ago. And I am the director of the Parish Collective, and our mission is to connect people to be the church in the neighborhood. And so a lot of overlap with ABCD. In fact, many years ago, I'm aging myself more than I want to be right now. We're talking decades, not years. I had the great honor of being trained in ABCD, both from some of the folks from Chicago and also, I think, connections with Jay and Mr. Littlejohn back in the day out in Seattle. And so learning how to see our neighborhoods and our communities from an asset-based, abundant kind of perspective, looking primarily for gifts and seeking to connect those as opposed to just looking at what's wrong and what's broken and what's horrific about our neighborhoods has been profoundly formative for me personally. And I would say also for the vast majority of the churches and faith communities that are connected to the Parish Collective all over the country.
Thank you, Tim.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I am a pastor that started a church about 11 years ago in the neighborhood called Lincoln Square, and moved from Alabama to Chicago, and took about a year of just walking the neighborhood, very much obsessing over this one square mile radius to learn it, understand it, get to know people there, connect the dots. And I've been doing that for 12 years. And that church has changed over time. I mean, the common thread, I think, as the changes have happened, you know, Chicago is a very unchurched city. I would say like 95% unchurched church, right? Like, or not even that, but when I first got there, I would even say anti-church. And I think that's changed over time, especially after the pandemic. But we've had to be extremely flexible of how we approach church and how we be good news and good neighbors because of that transiency. So I would say, even though it's been one church, it's been like 5 different demographics. We've gone from being a church of young adults to young families to having a safe place for multi-ethnic people feel like there's a safe haven in a neighborhood that's predominantly white, but surrounded by a lot of diversity. We're right next to the most diverse zip code in the nation, to the neighborhood to the west of us. And so, you know, we've adapted a lot, even post-pandemic, even having people who consider themselves de-churched or trying to figure out their relationship with evangelicalism and thinking that's not really the space for me. So the demographics have changed, and I can go into more detail about that. But in order to survive, we've really had to focus on the good of our neighborhood. And I'm noticing, you know, a lot of churches in Chicago, like our church, declined by probably 60% post-pandemic. And we had so many just shut down. And it's interesting to see the ones that have been tethered to their neighborhood as a kind of a through line of those that survive. So yeah, I met Tim as he moved to Chicago and getting to know each other a lot over the last 6 months. And it's good to be here to talk about faith and place and ABCD. ABCD. I added an E in there for some reason. It just kind of flows.
Yeah.
Evaluation.
Evaluation, economics, or anything in there. Yeah, absolutely. No, great. Thanks a lot, Pastor Brian. So Tim, I should mention we do have some shared heritage. I was part of the Community's First Association, and I know we were in the same space sometimes, especially with Little John, and others. So, coming back to you, I think you referenced a little bit about what Parish Collective is, but I just want to give you some space to say a little bit more about that. What is Parish Collective nationally? Just here to say more.
I'll say the brief history of the Parish Collective story, kind of the origin story, is that about 14 or 15 years ago now, I was also a young church planter in Seattle, and relatively soon out of seminary. And we probably shouldn't go too deep into this, but effectively, like, my hope and longing at the time was just to be a parish pastor. I probably wouldn't have used that language then, but I wanted to figure out how I might be able to help pastor not just a congregation, but an entire neighborhood. Like, how could we, as Brian said earlier, like, be good news in this place, particularly, and that was kind of a north downtown Seattle neighborhood. And even though I had a really wonderful seminary experience and lots of mentors, I had almost no idea how to go about that. And so I met a wonderful guy that some of you all might know, who also is thoroughly schooled and trained in ABCD, Paul Sparks, and he was transitioning a pretty big, kind of cool Gen X church in downtown Tacoma that was relatively regional, and they were trying to shift towards being effectively a downtown neighborhood church, but not just like, y'all come, like, we're really just about this parish, this place. And what gave rise to the Parish Collective was not actually at the time a grand vision of any kind. It was just, we don't know what we're doing and we need help. I mean, we, like, any scrap of encouragement can keep us alive, and it did. And so we would get our leadership teams together, and then how it grew is we would just start meeting more and more, both pastors and church planters, but also entrepreneurs and artists and community developers and activists and just faithful everyday moms and dads, and who were effectively asking similar questions and having similar longings as to how to figure out how to be the church in the everyday life of a place, and not feeling like there was a clear pathway. so the pathway we became each other's pathway as best we could. And that was quite a while ago. And so now it's grown through a bunch of convenings and conferences and learning communities and things like that, to where we're still very much trying to do the same thing. We're just trying to connect the people that want to be the church in the neighborhood. What's a little bit different now is it has grown kind of across the country in kind of different, I'd say, like hotspots, not everywhere for sure. And the other thing that's shifted, and I don't know if this is the experience of some of the folks that are tuning in or tune in later, but in the last decade, I would say the practical imagination for what the church is, and more importantly, what the church is for, just feels increasingly up for grabs. And so this is a question being asked by not just pastors, but everyday Christians, and certainly by denominational leaders and seminary leaders and foundations that support all those things. And while there, I would say, is no huge conclusion, what we have seen from churches all over the country is that when the primary question of the congregation is, what are the hopes and dreams of God in, with, and for this place, this parish, this neighborhood, if it's in a city or maybe a suburb or a rural area, when that becomes the primary question, it creates a different trajectory for the life of the church. And that has found to be really interesting. And I think there's a real connection there between how do we tether together and encourage and amplify the beautiful things and people and stories and systems that are already there and have been there for a long time, and how do we create more space for them? That's been pretty congruent, and increasingly I'd say denominational leaders are paying attention, and systems are paying attention. Not the majority, but a creative, vibrant minority within the kind of broader Christian space are saying, we think that maybe there are some different ways to be the church, and it's going to look a lot more relational and a lot more embedded within very particular places, even though it requires that we figure out how we learn from each other and try and name our blind spots and things like that.
Can you name that question again? I think that was just really profound. You said when a church or a congregation asks this question, it changes things.
I mean, really quickly, for those folks who are listening right now and are part of churches, or if they're leading churches, that they're really acutely, like as Brian was saying earlier, most church leaders or people who care about churches, understandably, find themselves asking oftentimes questions about the survival of the church, growing the church. How do we just stay alive? Which I just got to say is makes perfect sense, amongst all the change. And what we've discovered is that when you ask church questions, you get church answers. And without ever meaning to, we can kind of skip what God is doing. And most of our neighbors aren't asking church questions, but they might be asking God questions, namely, how is God repairing everything? What is God doing to restore and renew and reconcile me and my relationships and the systems that we co-create? And that big story, which I like to call God's dream, if that's the center and that's what we're always asking and trying to figure out within a very particular place, because that's who we are. We're embodied, limited creatures, and we can't be everywhere and do everything. When that becomes the driving question, then it doesn't mean that we don't ask church questions eventually. It's just not the primary question. And usually by asking the God question, namely, what is God up to? We figure out a way of life to get after the church question. And at its best, easier said than done, that helps solve some of the questions of purpose for the church. Oh, this is why we gather. Oh, this is why we forgive each other 70 times 7, because living in a neighborhood is hard. We get in fights, This is why we need to rely on, in the Christian tradition, the Spirit to be at work, because we can't make people change. These kinds of things begin to kind of bring a life of their own, but it's not a technique necessarily to grow the church. It's just a dare to faithfulness. And it's really hard to love God and neighbors and a neighborhood. It's actually very, very hard. In the same way that being married is hard, and being a parent is hard, and being a good uncle is actually hard. So we need each other. We need to figure this out together. And that's part of what we're trying to stitch together with the Parish Collective. That went too long, but you see, you pricked something in me there.
Like, yeah, profound. I really wanted to explore that. Honestly, that's really profound. Maybe we could draw a link then to back to Pastor Brian's work, because I feel like just for that little bit that we've heard from you, Pastor Brian, you're saying you started off by just kind of embodying, right? You lived in the neighborhood and really got to know people. I think that's been how you've operated. And I wonder for you, Tim, as we transition to Pastor Brian for a couple questions, when the community said, "Hey, what about churches? How are they? They've had this history of civic life, and what are they doing today, right?" And so, of course, I thought of you first, and then you said right away, we need to get Pastor Brian's story in here. And I wonder what it is that you saw in their story that made you feel that way.
Okay, so should I take that first?
Yeah, go ahead.
And then we'll go to Brian. Okay, well, really quickly. So like I said earlier, 6 months ago, we moved to Chicago, and my wife and I, kiddos, we live in Lincoln Square. And I was really longing to find any kind of faith community that I could be a part of that seemed to care about the neighborhood. And my expectations were not high, to be honest, because I've been around the block, and I know it's not obvious that congregations would care a whole lot about very particular places. And David in the chat is saying the bar is set really low. I mean, it is, and that's part of my work. But when I came across the church that Brian started, Missio Dei Lincoln Square, I was like nearly in tears just looking at the website, honestly. Like, it was like so profoundly caring about this place. And I know that it's hard. Like I said, but I don't care about that. What I care about is the desire expressed. And so we've been a part of Missio Dei for a couple of months now and love it. I feel like it's a really healthy church community. We're so grateful both to Brian and to the community there that's been really faithful for a long time. So it's the church that we're a part of. And it also, I feel like has for a long time and has the posture to continually be learning over and over for how in the world do we love God and love this neighborhood. That's never a one-size-fits-all kind of a thing. But I've just been so, so grateful for Brian's leadership and embodiment of this. I'll say the last thing that I would love to be a value that I think pretty much every church could adopt, but I've seen it in hundreds of ways at Missio Dei Lincoln Square, and that is a posture of listening, like fundamentally. Listening to God, listening to this place, listening to one another over and over and over again. And I feel like the cadences between that and how Brian has created the space and the value to do that is really powerful. I think that's how ministry should always begin and keep happening, is through lots and lots of listening. That never goes away. But when I've found congregations in my travels that have that as a real value, like a lived value, I'm always inspired. And that's been true at Missio Dei in Lincoln Square.
Yeah, thank you for that, Tim. So, Pastor
really
Brian, you've heard that. I'd love to I'm really gripped by this, right? So I'd love to hear more about Missio Dei, and if you could share more about the history and what is it you think is really powerful about the way the church is living out its purpose.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Thanks, Tim. Those are really kind words. That's why I joined this podcast. Tim is the most gracious, encouraging soul, and I needed that today. So I was like, I'm just going to join. Tim's going to say some good stuff, and
It's all true. We're recording this.
Um,
It's all true.
So yeah, I would say I was reflecting on this question. Very much true. First got here, neighborhood minded. The words grafted in. Those are the words that really guided me those first several years of ministry. That led me to really get to know, support small businesses, find ways to convene in small businesses that were local. I was handing out communion to homeless people, elements on the street, whatever I could do to be a presence, listen. It was almost like a listening tour of, but this was a new place for me, and so it was all about learning my environment and learning the gifts in the neighborhood, the key players, but not, and I think where I failed is early on, I do think there was this desire to be like, I want to be around those influential people in this neighborhood who are doing great things. There was some of that yielded fruit. But when I twisted the question, or because Lincoln Square is this neighborhood it was on the up and up when we got there. It had already been gentrified from the Latin Kings gang that dominated it back in the 90s. It had gentrified already. It was already on the up and up. Already a ton of neighborly minded people moved there. The people who are the wealthiest of Chicago and other neighborhoods, but people who are like middle class, I want to raise my family here. They moved to Lincoln Square because a lot of families move out of Chicago when they have kids. But this was a place that you could raise a family. One of my congregants actually designed posters for every neighborhood, and he called them slightly offensive posters. And Lincoln Squares was beer, bikes, brats, and babies. It's got some German roots there as well. And my neighbor was an author and writer for DNA Info, and she compared Lincoln Square to the Star Hollow of Gilmore Girls. So, I mean, this is a neighborhood where you've got like neighborhood concert out in the block several times over the summer, just a lot of good things. So I say all that because I wanted to be a part of those spaces, and I was, but where I really started to see a shift was, despite all the up and up, where are the isolated in my neighborhood? And I think that's a key question, because the moment I shifted my attention and listening to the isolated, God opened up a crazy amount of doors. So I began to we served local schools. We partnered with local schools, CPS schools, to help families that were in need with Thanksgiving meals. I walked outside of serving a school and saw a fledgling football team and became the head coach of a local high school. Uh, and that was also, Chicago has 11 selective enrollment schools. And so everyone's trying to figure out how to better the local schools. So long story short, I think that word of grafted into this already quaint and quirky neighborhood, but also not focusing on just the buzz and the influencers, but how are the isolated benefiting from the public economy in this neighborhood? There's a difference. There's a sense where a certain group benefit from the public economy, and then there's an isolated group that do not. And so we began to just get people in our congregation. So the school that I was, coaching at, we then got our actors in our church to teach acting classes there. Our ballet dancers in our church to do ballet dance there. So we just began to just help stir the pot of grafting people in, because I don't think place as an identity in a Western society is not like on the forefront of people's mind. And so I think part of the pastor's responsibility is to train people and thinking about the importance of place, the importance of loving your neighbor in a very place specific way. And then another unique thing about our area is in Chicago, there's aldermans. Aldermans are kind of like the mayors of a neighborhood. And we had a clergy coalition group of interfaith pastors, clergy, come together and say, what can we do for our neighborhood, and meet regularly. And that was beautiful. We started a food pantry out of that. We began to have forums on key issues. As I mentioned, a diverse neighborhood next to us. So when there was when Trump began to limit immigration on certain areas of the world in the Middle East, often referred to as the Muslim ban, we convened everyone together as faith leaders to say, like, how do we love our immigrant neighbors? No matter who you are, no matter what your politics are. And so the beauty and the challenge is, as I mentioned, the transiency. I'm always asking who's in the room of the church. Right now we have a ton of therapists. We just put together a mental health workshop for our neighborhood. But before, it used to be a lot of artists. So the challenge is that the longevity of some of the neighborhoodness can shift as our congregation has shifted. That's been the challenge. But I'm also kind of encouraged by that as I reflected, because I don't know, most nonprofits should have a goal to go out of business. They should actually find a problem that they can solve and say, we met that problem, let's go on to the next one. But that, you know, most won't do that. Most won't dare to go out of business. And so I've been encouraged by some of that, in the sense of course, the church is not going to go out of business, because that's spiritual needs always there. But some of the needs we met that were short-term needs. And so some of the integration and grafted ins always shifted. But that's a little bit of kind of how we've practiced some of this community-minded, place-making-minded endeavors. Also, it's just very important to us. Our logo, we changed our logo, and we actually put, a lot of churches have a skyline of Chicago, very tourist, logo. So we decided to put the Chicago municipal device. It's a little Y. You see it in the parks, the Chicago park districts. You'll see it on sewer plates. It's almost like a needle in the haystack scavenger hunt looking for the symbol. But true Chicagoans know this symbol. And so we put that in our logo to signify our love for our neighborhood and our city, just to kind of display how important this is to us. So yeah, I went on a little too long probably there, but that's a little bit about.
No, and that kind of gotta, oftentimes I ask the question, right? So there's people that are coming in, and maybe they are part of faith communities, or part of a nonprofit, part of some sort of institution or group that's trying to be more place-based, and so oftentimes I'll ask the question, what would be your advice, right? So where would somebody start? And I feel like you're naming some of this, right? So the listening, right? I think we call it a listening tour, might be a great way to start. And then weaving yourself into the life of the neighborhood. But what else? Did I catch that right? And then what else would you say? What other advice would you add?
Yeah, that's a good question. I can't give any like profound answers, but the simple answer is like, just start with the smallest, tightest block that you can. Like, go outside your house and look around and get to know your neighbors, and ask yourself, is me being here as a created being by some divine power, is me being here, am I a caretaker of this place so that my neighbors are actually better because I'm here? And I think if you can ask that question, are my neighbors better because I'm here? I think when you open your door and you really just start on the first 2 or 3 blocks of your street, great things begin to happen. And I think if you're a person of faith, and I'll say 2 things more on a bigger scale. If you're a person of faith, your pastor is probably, like Tim said, interested, but they're running their programs. They're caught up in the capitalistic story often that we just get sucked into, of consumer like dynamics. And they probably at the heart of their heart got into this because they want to love the place they're in. And so if you were to say, hey, pastor, what if I led a group to just like do this neighborhood audit? Like, what if we audited our neighborhood, made a list of all the small businesses, all the nonprofits, all the key players, all the needs, all the gifts, and what if we just began to pray over a year, like, what's our role? Could I do that? That would be a gift to any pastor or faith leader. And then I would say, if you're not a faith leader, if you're not a person of faith, approaching those pastors and inviting them into these conversations in the spaces that are happening in the neighborhood. And hopefully you'll find some pastors that have learned to lessen their ego enough to just be a listener in those spaces, to know that the church is never going to be the dominant place of society, right? We're always going to kind of be on the underside of power. And for them just to be present in those spaces and learn. So I would say reach out to them, invite them in, so they can be learners would be a huge gift to the faith community in the neighborhood working together.
Yeah, thank you. And it feels like there's rich language that I think is emerging, like I think about the Presencing Institute, right? So whether it's listening, like you're saying, Tim, right? What is God up to? Or it's, what's the emergent future? But I think that comes from a similar stance for the world, toward our neighborhood around us. And so, yeah, I think whatever your background is, I think there's something here that's really, really profound. I do want to know real quick, we have been posting in the text. Make sure you do go visit Missio Dei website and of course also Parish Collective. So there's ways to do that. So Tim, coming back to you, and I want to transition soon to question that have been popping in here, but can you say a little bit more about sort of like the big picture, right? So Missio Dei is exemplar, but you're connected to a lot of parishes, a lot of churches, a lot of congregations. You've been a part of a lot of different stories. I wonder if you could share from that perspective, what else would you recommend to somebody as what's a way that a congregation or a faith community, what could be some next steps that could come out of a conversation like this advice that you would give?
Well, if we kind of walk up the steps from the dance floor that Brian's talking about into the balcony, to borrow that Ronald Lefevitz's metaphor, like I was talking about earlier, I think that this is one of the most interesting times for those people that consider themselves a part of either religious or part of the Christian tradition or whatever. They go to church, they don't go to church, they care. We are living in such really interesting times. I think that there's actually a lot at stake, and a lot is going to transition and change in the next decade, is my guess. I liked how I loved Brian's answer. I also think that it's kind of interesting to talk about what's possible from the perspective of people that are like of faith and maybe of not. I think for those of us who are a part of churches, I think that, and maybe it's the same answer for both. If you're a follower of Jesus and you want to, or feel like, the idea to love our neighbors and neighborhood is not like a good idea, it's a command. Just like loving enemies. It's actually much harder to do than just a mental assent. But to follow the advice of what Brian was saying and just think about not just like just paying attention, as important as that is, but inviting that next step. Like what might this mean for me? It might just mean creating some spaces of hospitality. It might be joining something that's already happening. And that doesn't have to be a ministry thing. It might be like, there's a neighbor council and I should join that, so I can keep listening. It might mean continuing to get some friends and kind of prayerfully pay attention until you feel like you're invited into some next step of faithful presence. I think it's really, really powerful. And I know this is not always possible, but if whatever neighborhood you're a part of, whether you worship there or not, if you can find a friend or two or another family or two and just kind of ask these questions of how come might we pay attention together, or how might we do kind of an audit and then discern, I just think that's really powerful. That's going to take you on a journey. And it might start with what might we do, but I promise you, and this is part of the gift of the Christian tradition, you try something, like you show up to that, neighborhood council, you're going to be invited to change yourself. Like, I actually think the Spirit of God will invite you to become a different kind of a person. Like, you're going to have to become more patient if you're going to stick it out. You're probably going to have to become more curious. You're probably going to have to you might have blind spots about how you show up in a space, or the thing that you said that you didn't mean to say, or whatever. When we do stuff, this is part of the gift and challenge of trying to be the church in the neighborhood, or even trying to be a good neighbor, is you try and you actually screw up, you fail. And that then invites a whole different posture of, well, do you double down and say, well, I'm right and you're wrong and y'all are foolish? Or do you say, maybe I'm being invited into the story of transformation of this place. Like, I actually need to change, even though I'm pursuing the transformation of this place. And I think that's a huge gift. It goes along with listening. In the Christian tradition, it's called repentance, but that's just turning 180 and saying, okay, that didn't work. And the more that we're able to do this together, I actually think that makes our collective life more compelling, actually. So don't be afraid of screwing up. But when we do, we have to do our best to own it and apologize and make repairs. But I've just been thinking a lot more about this lately. I mean, with all of the horrific injustices that get played out in all of our neighborhoods and of course across the world, like, a big part of the mission of the church is to join in God's grand repair of the world. And we don't always do that perfectly. And maybe the same is true for folks that are not of faith. I feel like there's like a secret weapon that most generally either, well, even like folks that aren't like de-churched people or within more like secular or humanist traditions, I think there's like a secret weapon they don't know about, and that is, if they would spend, I don't know, and maybe this is you listening, spend 5 minutes getting to know like what we're supposed to be doing, meaning loving God, loving neighbor, trying to join in the renewal of everything, and then keep us to that story. You know, you can believe whatever you want, for sure, but we actually could use the encouragement. You know, I've been thinking about that a lot more. Like, there's a lot of people that are really angry about the church for good reasons, but if you dig a little bit deeper, one place of encouragement is to say, it seems like this is your story. Your story is to be like the connective tissue in the neighborhood that brings us all together and encourages us and gives yourself away on behalf of the collective flourishing, right? And then if we're honest, we'd say, well, yeah. And they say, well, great, keep doing it. Maybe even here's how I can help. I think that's a way better story than what can feel, I gotta say, as a Christian, like, y'all are idiots, we just wish you would go away. That actually doesn't lead to community flourishing. It doesn't lead to collective liberation. It doesn't actually lead to too much justice. It leads often to more polarization. As Brene Brown says, shame is not a great tool of liberation. So I feel like I would love to see more and more of that. And of course, from other faith traditions as well, like kind of calling us into our biggest and best stories that we're already tied up in anyway. I think that's kind of a secret weapon.
Love that.
I think real quick, I think a problem I see often, and this is probably both faith and non-faith, is everybody wants to do something, but nobody does anything. So there's this sense of loss of collective. Everybody's got their niche thing that they want to do. And so I think humbling ourselves is a huge, huge part of this work, to say, like, you know, I'm willing to sense and listen to what the community is getting after and do what is happening here, where the versus like my thing. I just wanted to say that because I just think so many people in churches are like, I've got this one thing, you know, and it's very focused on, I want to start the knit group and get all the grandmas together and knit. And it's like, that's great. It's how do you broaden that to like this humble posture of listening and and have that humility to sense the collective.
Well, and here, I know we got to get to questions here, Eric, but that makes me think to such an important point, Brian. I don't think it's too out there to say that we live in, at least in most parts of the United States. Honestly, I think it's even a little bit more on the West Coast that I came from, in Seattle. One of the most individualistic cultures in human history. And place or neighborhood or parish, even feeling that you're a part of it, or that is you even care, or maybe that you're like embracing it as a part, not in full, your identity. Like, I care about this place. I want to be a character in the story of this place. That is countercultural to the look at me and how I am so special kind of story that we hear over and over and over again. And that's a way where I think the collectivist communal value of the church is really, really needed. It might not be cool. It might be hard. I think it does require humility. And necessarily it's going to be a little bit of a limiting. Like, you can't be a character in, 4 or 5 neighborhoods very easily. You kind of got to pick one or two, and probably a primary and maybe a secondary. And if more and more of us would do that, especially if we're seeking to listen for the flourishing of that place, I think we'd find ourselves caught up in all kinds of incredible stories.
Yeah. Hey, this has been such a rich discussion. Really, really appreciate this time. I'm learning so much, and it's compelling. This idea of what if the church was that connective tissue that was bringing flourishing, or catalyzing flourishing, or partnering with God and creating more flourishing, right? So really love the rich language coming out of this. I do want to get to some questions that have been posted. I always like to take just a brief minute here, just to say again, do make sure you visit greatlakesurban.org, get to know a little bit more about us. We, at our heart, we want to see more and more neighborhoods coming into that kind of this more connected, safer, more thriving, more flourishing life. And I've got a methodology for doing that. Helping communities build the structures and the relationships to make that possible and sustained over the long haul. And if you can be a part of investing in more flourishing at the place-based level, and so you can donate to Glue, and that's a Great Lakes Urban, and that's where that will go toward new neighborhoods being brought into this way of life. I do want to note some comments here. First of all, Eric Howell had some hearts here, just I think an encouragement, finding this as a significant conversation. Thank you, Eric. David Burton says, your immediate 8. Your neighbors could be more, but it should never be less. Ask if you moved. Would any neighbor miss you or even realize you are gone? That is always convicting. That kind of gets back to what you were saying, Pastor Brian. And then, let's see. Again, David says, unfortunately, my one thing is neighbors and neighborhoods. Neighborhood 8. I think what I see in and outside of the church is a high degree of selfishness. Everything's about what is in it for me. Dave Runyon once told me that we need to explain to people what is in it for them when it comes to neighboring. I always expect more, since loving our neighbor is one of the big 2 commands. And Megan Ginn was just reminding us of where to go for the Great Lakes Urban site. Okay, so now to some questions. Thanks for your comments, folks. Let's see, JS, would you agree that the health of the church trumps the health of the place for most church leaders?
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Their view of the church being healthy is more important than the health of the place. And I would say that's true. I think, when Jesus walked this earth, what he was creating, I love Dave's comment, loving your neighbor. The biblical ethic was communal, not individual. And we've moved so much in the West to individual purpose being the great ethic. If I can find my individual purpose, that's the great purpose and meaning. Whereas the communal ethic, loving your neighbor, and Dorothy Day would say, such a bulldog for the kingdom as a Catholic activist, you can only love God as much as the person you love the least. So you might think you're healthy, but your relationship to your neighbor is what the Bible always points us back to as what is truly healthy. And so it's true. And so when Jesus walked this earth, this relationship was something important. Somehow over time, church became a business. And where we've lost our way, and I would also indict most human efforts at organizing. We've gotten so fixated on the data or the statistics or the high level conversations that we've removed love. So we're really fixating on an analytical, intellectual thing when we've lost the way of love. And so you can't measure love. We like to do what we can measure, and we think we're successful. We can't measure love. So it gets the bottom rung. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, thank you, Pastor Brian. I'm going to skip around a little bit. I'm noticing the time, and that we've got a lot of questions here. I'm going to skip around a little bit now. I'm going to beg forgiveness for if I miss yours. Wayne asks, I find the use of we and I intriguing. There seems to be an underlying set of assumptions that I and we need to make the lives of neighbors better, that I or we need to be the good news or model love your neighbor. Is it possible that I or we are made better because of our neighbor's influence, or that good news is flowing most powerfully through others in surprising and unexpected ways? What does it mean for the smaller we to be enfolded into the story of the larger we? Really, what does it mean for the church to adapt to its cultural decentering and to fully adopt a posture of support of what God is already doing? Yeah. Tim, do you want to take that one first?
Sure. I think that's an important and kind of lovely point. I would maybe parse it out this way. Since it is a command that we love God and neighbors and neighborhoods, we do, I think the desire for us to collectively be good news is a good thing. I think that's a great aspiration. I also think that there is no competition in being great neighbors, and that in most neighborhoods, probably the amount of good news is probably not emanating from Christians or churches necessarily. And so listening for and joining and celebrating and giving to and amplifying the good things that are already happening is a fantastic way to join that good news. The only slight distinction I would say, so you could easily develop even a communal I or we kind of a savior complex. Like we're the ones who are bringing good news as opposed to trying to join it. But, and maybe this is the Seattle in me, maybe I need to spend more time. I've not been in Chicago long enough, but I can say that this happened I'll just own this. I think this happened with me. And I think it was a part of the culture, like being enculturated to maybe living in Seattle for a long time. I spent so much time trying to listen and learn from other neighbors that I felt afraid to talk about any kind of Christian distinction or identity in public very often. And I don't think that's healthy, because I think fundamentally it's a gift. And that doesn't mean you're always like contorting people to try and just believe what you believe or being obnoxious or anything like that. But I do think that, maybe this is obvious now. I'm betting on the Christian story being true, and it might not be. It's faith. But I think we would all do better if we could say, yeah, this is the story that I'm betting on. But that doesn't mean that like just because we do that, we automatically are good news or certainly are quote unquote right. A bunch of people listening in probably are familiar with Peter Block, and I remember he one time said, and I agree with him, that the opposite of love is not hate, it's certainty. And there's a lot of Christians and congregations who've kind of felt the growing crust of certainty and tried to protect that in their neighborhoods. And that can be pretty yucky. But the opposite can be true too, where we just refuse to kind of name anything about our Christian story or our identity. And I don't think that's actually the fullest possible gift to our neighbors, regardless of what they believe.
Thank you, Tim. Pastor Brian, anything you want to share there? Or I can also move on.
I thought Tim said it beautifully. I know we're short on time. I don't want to make sure we get to more questions. But.
Yeah. Let's see. Jay asks, do you have stories of church leaders connecting neighbors with neighbors to dream and act together?
I think the most successful I've seen Christian leaders do that was when they joined in the efforts to do that, and it wasn't under the church brand. But when you make it under the church brand, I rarely see it succeed. That's my short answer.
My short answer would be, I have seen that happen hundreds and hundreds of ways in hundreds of neighborhoods and cities. But I agree with Brian. Usually, I mean, to reference Peter Block again, I think the vast majority of leadership is convening. And I've seen lots and lots of church leaders convene neighbors on behalf of the common good, or, neighborhood flourishing, or whatever you want to use. But I also, this is maybe a personal conviction. If you think of like a neighborhood meeting, when you go around, and this is my experience in a couple different places, but if you go around and like everyone's introducing themselves, and you come to, say, when I was a pastor, oftentimes the presumption is just like what Brian was talking about. Oh, okay, if we're trying to sizing each other up here and discerning what people are in this meeting for, or what they're in it for, it's confusing what the pastor or the church person wants. Are you just trying to convert me, or trying to get you to church? And I think the special role of the church, maybe not exclusively, but there's not a lot out there that do this, is to convene on behalf of the common good, because that is our story. And that is not necessarily a story for an affordable housing developer or a local business, or even a lot of nonprofits who have a specific niche issue, whether it be domestic violence prevention or climate justice or whatever. It's a unique, at least religious, if not Christian, gift. And I think we need to cultivate that more.
Yeah, thank you again for that. I think we can close out with one more here, just picking from the list. As church leaders, do you get personally involved in the systemic and political stories of the place you occupy?
Yeah, I can take that. I think we do, but not because we're asking from a church leader perspective. We think of Jesus as having this alternative kingdom, and that kingdom doesn't fit into the ideology purity that our society portrays. So a lot of times the challenge is most people want a very binary purity of ideology to their politics, and it doesn't always fit neatly. But an example for us is I became dear friends with an activist who was a person of faith, who uncovered the Laquan McDonald video, who was shot 16 times in Chicago in 2012 by Jason Van Dyke, police officer. And that story was one where we felt like the church really needed to speak up to and convene spaces about police brutality and step in. And so that led on for years and years of showing up in those spaces, showing up, and really also asking that question where I was saying that Lincoln Square was kind of on this up and up, was where the isolated also led us to find sistering neighborhoods in our city that we needed to, love and pay attention to. and so we're kind of developing these like relationships with other neighborhoods across our city that we want to develop a strengthening relationship with through that. So I would say yes, and that but the challenge is as a faith leader, clarifying for your people, this is a issue that God cares about. This is because people are connected to it. We don't have to play by the boxes that are portrayed of this purity of ideology, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I would slightly, I mean, we all know that like to live a life at all means like, of course, we're engaging with political systems, economic systems, educational systems, etc. We create and co-create all of these systems. The Christian distinction, as Brian said, I think really beautifully, is, of course, all local churches are in some ways political, meaning they participate in what gets decided or not, unless they're completely divorced from it. But I would say political involvement can be very different than partisan involvement, even at a local level. So like, and maybe that's just maybe a personal take, but life is political. Life is economic. Like I don't know how that could ever be avoided.
And one area I'm finding a lot of hope in is as individual churches on decline in attendance, and I'm noticing a shift in both the left and the right are saying in their own different ways that we really needed houses of worship. So I think there's like this beautiful collision of how innovation and change happens, where you have this decline of individual attendance, dissatisfaction with church status quo, yet institutions, foundations, key power players in that sphere are saying on left and right, for various reasons, we have to have houses of worship. And so to me, that's really interesting, that collision.
Yeah, that makes me think, maybe Tim, you could just say this very briefly in 30 seconds, but someone asked, kind of on that, they say, I'm a person of faith. I feel isolated because my church is church focused and not neighborhood focused. Do you have advice?
And the advice is to do your best to pay attention to that neighborhood that you're in, and then do some scriptural, perhaps kind of theological reflection on that, and see if you can find a friend or two to do that with you. I mean, usually there's not, you on your own are probably not going to change the entire culture of the church. But if you grab a couple friends and start doing some experiments and sharing those stories, the tide can turn. In my last 7 seconds, I'd say, and this is no fault of this is not a slam to Brian whatsoever. I think he'll probably agree with it. Church cultural change can never be led exclusively by clergy. It has to come from at least the majority of the bottom up. So just that dissonance, that holy discontent, that maybe we're not quite as focused on the flourishing of the neighborhood as I would like, cultivate that and be in relationship with church leadership, because that's how things change.
Great. And Brian, Pastor Brian, what's giving you hope these days?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think this right here is giving me hope. I mean, I'm seeing this thread, I'm seeing Tim, Jay, Wayne, Eric, Megan, all these people commenting, the people on this call showing up. It's 13 participants right now, and I'm sure other will watch it online. But like Tim said, Jesus had a big vision, but he acted very small. All of his steps to fulfill the vision were so small and relational, and that change will never happen faster than the speed of trust, they say, right? And I'm trusting that the people in this room are gonna take to something from today, and myself included. Whenever you show up in these spaces, it's a reminder for ourselves, like Tim said, this is very hard work, sacrificial work, and I'm very hopeful that there's people who are thinking this way more and more and seeing the importance of place.
Well, I hate to do this, but we're at that time. We've got to wrap up. Tim, you referenced Peter Block, and leadership is convening most of it, and so we've convened and we've gathered and we've learned from each other. And I just would invite you to go out with increased hope, and leave this place thinking about what's that one thing I can do, to go small and think about those around me. All right. Well, thank you once again. A huge thank you, Pastor Brian, Tim Soerens, for joining us, for sharing your insights and wisdom, your experiences. Thank you for all the questions. Thanks to everyone who joined and who's watching after. And blessings on your day.
Everybody, thank you.
Thank you.